down. Too late. The valley exploded. 14 men pinned in a kill zone somebody had chosen for them, rounds chewing the rock 6 inches from her skull. And on the ridge above, a sniper nobody had thought to cover, lining up his next shot. She was the medic, the small one, the quiet one nobody looked at twice. She crawled to a dead man's rifle, checked the wind off a scrap of cloth, and breathed out. Not all the way, just enough. 420 meters. She fired first. When the shape on that ridge folded and didn't get up, the entire valley went silent. 14 men staring at a woman who wasn't supposed to know one end of a rifle from the other. 3 weeks later, medics found her half frozen in a ravine, no ID, no name, ready to die. Until they turned over her rifle and saw the symbol carved into the stock.
The mountain didn't care that she was dying. It never does. Mountains don't keep score, don't remember names, don't care whether the woman bleeding out in their shadow spent her whole life becoming someone strong enough to end up exactly here, exactly like this, exactly alone. That was the first thing the medics noticed. Not the blood, not the fever that had cooked her skin to the color of old paper. The mountain. Wind cutting through the ravine like it had somewhere better to be. Snow starting to fall sideways at 4,000 feet, and her lying there in the middle of it, one arm wrapped around a rifle like it was the only thing left in the world worth holding. Because it was. Because a rifle doesn't ask questions, doesn't flinch when you tell it the truth, doesn't look at you like you're something broken that needs fixing before it can be trusted again. "Got a live one," the lead medic called out. His name was Grady. 22 years in the field, and he'd learned to say things flat. No excitement, no dread, just facts, because facts were the only thing that got you through. "Female, unresponsive. Multiple lacerations possible. Internal bleeding, hypothermia setting in." His partner knelt beside her. Young, first deployment, hands already shaking before they even touched her. "She's got no tags, no ID, nothing." "Check the weapon." "What?" "The weapon, check it." The kid pried her fingers loose, one at a time. She didn't let go easy. Even half dead, some part of her held on like the rifle was the last true thing she had left to say. And when he finally got it free and turned it over in the gray light, he went still. Because there, etched into the stock, small, deliberate, a raven wing spread caged inside the lines of a compass rose. "Grady," his voice cracked. "Grady, you need to see this." Grady looked, and something in his face changed. Not shock exactly, recognition. The kind that arrives late and hits harder for it. "That's her," he said. "Her who?" "The one from the extraction 3 weeks back, the ghost, the one nobody could put a name to." He looked down at the woman in the snow, barely breathing, blood crusted black along her hairline. "She's the one who saved 14 SEALs and vanished before anybody could say thank you." The kid stared at her face like it might rearrange itself into something he recognized. It didn't. Just a woman. Young, beautiful, in the wrecked, unbothered way of someone who'd stopped caring what she looked like a long time ago. Broken. Alive. Barely. 27, maybe. Hard to tell under the swelling and the frostbite, and 3 weeks of exposure written into skin that should have belonged to somebody twice her age by now. Whoever she was, wherever she'd come from, the mountain had tried its best to erase her. It hadn't quite managed it. "Then who is she?" Grady didn't answer right away. He was already lifting her, already moving, already shouting for the litter. Because there'd be time for the question later. Right now there was only the countdown, the one that mattered. The one where every second she stayed unconscious in this cold was a second closer to never waking up at all. They moved fast. Had to. 2 men carrying a litter over rock that didn't want to be walked on, boots skidding on loose scree, breath fogging out in ragged clouds. The kid kept glancing back at her face like he expected her to wake up and explain herself. She didn't. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise. Her pulse, when Grady found it, was a thread, not a heartbeat, a rumor of one. "BP's dropping," Grady called out. "Get the bird warmed up, we're losing her." "She's not going to make the flight." "She's gonna make the flight." He said it like an order, like saying it firm enough could make it true. Because Grady had seen enough men and women die on mountains like this one to know that the ones who fought the hardest were usually the ones nobody expected to be fighting at all. And something about this woman, this small, wrecked, unnamed woman with a Legends rifle wrapped in her arms, told him she'd already survived things that should have killed her twice over. The helicopter blades started turning before they even reached the clearing. But if you want to understand how she got here, bleeding out in a ravine nobody had a name for, clutching a rifle with her father's mark carved into the wood, you have to go back. Further than the extraction, further than the mission that made her a legend nobody could identify. You have to go back to Montana. To a lake house that smelled like gun oil and pine smoke. To a girl who was 8 years old the first time her father put a rifle in her hands and told her the truth would always cost her something, so she'd better make sure it was worth it. Her name was Marlowe Sinclair, and this is how she almost died to save people who never even learned her name. 15 years earlier, a cabin on the edge of Flathead Lake, Montana. Morning light slanting gold through pine needles. Marlowe was 12 years old, and she already knew how to field strip a rifle faster than most grown men could load one. Her father called it play. It wasn't play. Play didn't come with a stopwatch. Play didn't end with him crouched behind her, adjusting her elbow half an inch, murmuring in that low, even voice that never once raised, no matter how many times she got it wrong. Breathe out. Not all the way, just enough. I know, Dad, you don't, because if you knew, you wouldn't be yanking that trigger like it owes you money. She laughed. Couldn't help it. Because that was Holt Sinclair for you. 22 years a soldier, and somehow he still found a way to make a firing range sound like a joke between friends. Command Sergeant Major Holt Sinclair, 6'2", hands like carved oak. A man who'd walked through deserts most people only saw on the news and came home each time a little quieter than before. He never talked about the wars. Not really, just fragments. A name here, a silence there. The kind of silence that told you more than words ever could. Someday, he told her once, lying on their backs in the tall grass behind the cabin, watching a hawk circle somewhere above the tree line. You're gonna be better than me at this. You always say that, because it's always true. Every year a little more true. He turned his head, looked at her the way fathers look at daughters when they already know something the daughter doesn't. Something about time. Something about how little of it there sometimes is. Whatever happens, Marlowe, whatever I can't be there for, you remember what I taught you. Not just the shooting, the rest of it. What rest of it? That the truth's gonna cost you every time. So you make sure you're only spending it on things worth the price. She didn't understand it then, not really. She was 12. 12-year-olds don't understand fathers who talk like they're leaving pieces of themselves behind on purpose. That night at dinner, her mother Ruth watched them come in from the range with the particular expression of a woman who'd married a soldier and raised a daughter who might become one too, and wasn't sure yet whether to be proud or terrified. Probably both. Usually both. You smell like gunpowder, Ruth said, setting a plate in front of Marlowe. Smells like Tuesday, Holt said, and Ruth swatted him with the dish towel, and for a moment the kitchen was just a kitchen. Warm, ordinary, the kind of ordinary you don't know to treasure until it's gone. You're not turning her into a soldier, Holt. I'm turning her into somebody who doesn't need anybody's permission to survive, he said it lightly. But his eyes, when they found Marlowe's across the table, weren't light at all. World doesn't hand out mercy based on how sweet you smile, Ruthie. Better she learns that now, from me, not later, from somebody who doesn't love her. Ruth didn't argue after that. She just reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind Marlowe's ear the way she'd done 1,000 times before and said nothing, because some truths in that house didn't need saying out loud. They just settled into the walls like wood smoke. Stayed there. There was a night, a few weeks before the men in dress uniforms came, when she woke to find her father sitting alone on the back porch at 2 in the morning cleaning a rifle that was already clean. She stood in the doorway a long time before he noticed her. Can't sleep? He asked without turning around. Neither can you. He almost smiled. patted the step beside him, and she sat pulling her knees up against the cold, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Just the crickets, just the lake dark and flat as glass under a sky so full of stars it looked unreal.
"You scared, Dad?"
He was quiet long enough that she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then, every time. Man tells you he's not scared going where I go, he's either lying or he's already dead inside, and neither one of those is somebody you want covering your back. Then why go? Because somebody has to, and because I'm good at it, and because... He stopped, set the rifle down across his knees, looked at her with an expression she wouldn't understand the full weight of until years later, long after he was gone. Because there are things worth protecting, even when protecting them costs you everything you've got. You'll understand that someday. I hope you don't have to learn it the way I did. She didn't understand it then. She understood the rest of it 3 months later. Because that was when 2 men in dress uniforms came up the gravel drive in a government sedan, and her mother's hand found the door frame before her knees could find the floor, and Marlowe stood in the hallway in her socks and watched her whole world get quietly, formally, unforgivably rearranged. Missing. Presumed. Classified. Those were the words. Not dead. Never dead. Just gone. Folded into paperwork the government would never fully unfold. No body, no answers, no closure, because closure requires an ending, and this was just an absence that kept on being absent, year after year after year. She kept the rifle he'd trained her on. She kept the range days alone, now just her and the wind and the target and the sound of her own heartbeat between breaths. And she kept the thing he told her, the thing about truth costing something, tucked away in the back of her mind like a splinter she never quite worked free. 15 years. That's how long she carried it. 15 years until a phone rang in a 2-room apartment outside a military base in North Carolina, and a stranger's voice on the other end changed everything again. The training facility didn't look like much from the outside. Low concrete buildings, a chain-link fence, a flag that never stopped snapping in the wind no matter what the weather did. Marlowe Sinclair walked through the front gate wearing medic fatigues 2 sizes too practical for anyone to notice her twice. That was the point. 5'3", a build that made people assume things. Soft-spoken, when she spoke at all. She'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to move unseen through a room full of soldiers was to let them underestimate her on sight, and men, in this line of work, were remarkably predictably eager to do exactly that. "You're the new medic," said the man checking her in. Sergeant, bored, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Contract medic, yes." "Sinclair." He read the name off the form, stopped, looked up properly for the first time. "Any relation to—" "No," she said, fast, practiced. A lie she'd worn smooth as a river stone from repeating it so many times. Common name. It wasn't common. It wasn't a lie she was proud of, but her father's name still opened doors in certain rooms and slammed them shut in others, and she'd learned the hard way which rooms were which. The sergeant shrugged, didn't push, handed her a badge and pointed her toward the medical bay, and that was that. Just another face, just another pair of hands that knew how to pack a wound and start an IV and stay calm while a man screamed. Nobody in that building had any idea what those hands could do with a rifle at 400 yards. She liked it that way, or she told herself she did. The medical bay was small, cramped, smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee in equal measure. Marlowe had barely set her bag down before a young operator wandered in, favoring a taped-up wrist, grinning like getting hurt was half the fun of the job. "New medic." He said it like an announcement. "Beckett Iverson. Everybody just calls me Iverson because apparently Beckett sounds like a guy who does yoga." "Marlowe." She didn't offer a last name, didn't need to. "Let me see the wrist." "It's fine. It's swollen to twice its normal size, and you're holding it like it's made of glass." "Sit." He sat. Something about her voice made people sit, she'd noticed. Not loud, not commanding, just certain in a way that left no room for argument. Iverson watched her work, wincing when she pressed the joint, and somewhere in the quiet of that small room he seemed to decide she was worth talking to. "You don't say much," he said.
I say what's useful.
"That's a very efficient way to live. It's a very efficient way to not get people killed." She wrapped the wrist tight precise and looked up at him with an expression that wasn't unkind, just weighted with something older than her 27 years. "You're going to want to ice this. And stop punching the wall when you lose at cards."
Iverson's grin faltered.
You've got bruising consistent with impact against a flat, rigid surface, and there's a deck of cards sticking out of your cargo pocket. She shrugged. "Not magic, just paying attention." He laughed, surprised, and something in that laugh told her he'd remember this. Remember her. Not as a threat. Not yet. Just as someone sharper than she let on, which in this business was sometimes a dangerous thing to be noticed for. She didn't know yet how much that would matter, not for weeks. But some part of her, the part her father had built brick by brick on a Montana firing range, filed him away too. Everyone got filed away. That was the job, even when the job was pretending to only be bandages and IV lines. Later that week, she found herself sitting alone in the mess hall at an hour when the mess hall was supposed to be empty. Just her and a cup of coffee gone cold, and a duffel bag under her chair that nobody else on this base had ever seen open. Inside it, wrapped in an old flannel shirt that still, impossibly 3 years on, smelled faintly of pine smoke, her father's rifle. She hadn't fired it since the funeral that never happened, the memorial with no casket. The flag her mother folded into a triangle and set on the mantel because there was nothing else of him left to bury. She'd almost sold it once, needed the money more than the memory, or told herself she did. Sat in a pawn shop parking lot in Missoula with the case on the seat beside her for 40 minutes before she turned the engine back on and drove home instead. Some things she'd learned weren't actually for sale. You just had to find that out the hard way first. "You always eat alone?" She looked up. Iverson, again, tray in hand, that same easy grin that hadn't yet learned what the job could take from a person. "I like the quiet. Everybody here likes the quiet till they don't." He sat anyway, uninvited the way young soldiers do when they haven't yet been told no often enough to believe it. "You're good, you know. Whatever else you are. Good hands, calm under pressure. Guys talk about that stuff. Word gets around." "I just do my job." "Sure." He studied her a beat too long. "You ever think about cross-training? Combat arms track. Be a waste of medic with hands like yours." She almost laughed. If only he knew how much of a waste it already was. All that skill, folded up small and quiet inside a role nobody looked at twice. But that was the arrangement she'd made with herself the day she signed the contract. Stay small. Stay unseen. Get close enough to the machinery of this world to find out what happened to her father, and get out before anyone asked the wrong question at the wrong time. "I think about a lot of things," she said instead. "Eat your lunch, Iverson." He laughed, took the dismissal in stride, and left her alone with her cold coffee and the ghost of a man who used to tell her that truth cost something. She was beginning to understand just how right he'd been. She met Hadley 2 days later in the gym attached to the barracks, though met wasn't quite the word for it. He was doing pull-ups in the corner, showing off for an audience of exactly nobody, counting out loud in a voice that carried across the whole room whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. 41. 42. He dropped down, wiped his hands on his shorts, and caught her watching from the doorway with the particular smirk of a man who'd never once in his life doubted his own charm. "You judging my form, or just admiring the view?" "Your elbows flaring on the way up. You're losing power you don't need to lose." His smirk faltered just slightly. "You a trainer too, or just full of opinions?" "Medic. And I notice things. Occupational hazard." She shrugged, already turning to leave. "Fix the elbow. You'll thank me the day it matters." "When exactly is that supposed to be?" "I don't know yet," she said. And something in the way she said it made him actually stop and look at her properly for the first time, the way people sometimes did when a joke landed somewhere more serious than they'd intended. She hadn't meant anything by it, not really. But 3 weeks later, crouched behind a boulder with her hands buried in the wound his flared elbow had nothing to do with, she'd think back on that gym and wonder whether some part of her had already known, even then, that she was going to need every ounce of attention she'd ever paid to every person on this base. The team she was assigned to called themselves Widow 6, a joint task force, part contractor, part special operations liaison, the kind of unit that existed in the gray spaces between official and deniable. Marlowe had learned not to ask too many questions about the gray spaces. Questions cost you clearance. Clearance cost you jobs. And jobs, however strange, however quiet, were the only thing keeping her close enough to the machinery of the military to maybe someday find out what actually happened to her father. That was the real reason she was here. Not the paycheck, the truth. She just hadn't told anyone that part. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some nights, when the base had gone quiet enough that even the flag stopped snapping against its pole, she walked out to the far edge of the property where an old, unused firing range sat rusting behind a hurricane fence nobody bothered locking anymore. She'd brought nothing but a service pistol those first few times, telling herself it was just maintenance, just muscle memory, nothing worth remarking on. By the 3rd week, she was climbing the fence with a rifle case slung across her back instead. She never fired more than a handful of rounds, never stayed more than 20 minutes, long enough to feel the old rhythm settle back into her hands, breathe out, not all the way, just enough, and short enough that nobody patrolling the perimeter would notice a light where no light should be. She told herself this was discipline, staying sharp, the kind of quiet competence that had nothing to do with the ache she still carried some nights, worse than others, for a father who used to stand behind her on nights just like this one, correcting her elbow by half an inch and calling it play. It wasn't discipline, not really. It was the only place left in her life where she didn't have to pretend to be smaller than she was. And some part of her had started needing that more than she wanted to admit. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and cold nerves. Marlowe sat in the back row the way she always did, boots crossed at the ankle, hands folded, doing her best impression of a woman who found all of this mildly interesting and nothing more. Around her, 14 operators in various states of undress and readiness. Loud, easy with each other in the way men get when they've bled together and lived to complain about it. At the front stood the man in charge, Captain Elias Marrowe, 44, gray threading through dark hair at the temples, a face that had learned somewhere along the way to stop giving anything away for free. He had the kind of stillness that made a room quiet without him raising his voice. And when he looked out over the assembled team, his eyes passed over Marlowe for half a second longer than they passed over anyone else. She felt it, that half second, filed it away, and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. "Hostage situation," Marrowe said, pulling up satellite imagery on the screen behind him. 3 American contractors, taken 11 hours ago from a supply convoy outside the border region. Local militia backed by a private security network we've been tracking for the better part of a year. "Which network?" someone asked from the front row. Marrowe's jaw tightened. Just barely. "Vario Solutions." A ripple went through the room. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The kind soldiers reserve for names that mean trouble wearing a suit. "Vario's not militia," said a voice near Marlowe, young, confident, in the specific way of men who hadn't yet been wrong about anything that mattered. Hadley. She'd cataloged him already. 24, SEAL trainee attached for cross-unit experience. Good instincts, better mouth. "Virio's a contractor show. We fought their guys in the sandbox. This a hostage op, or are we walking into something bigger?" "It's a hostage op," Marlowe said. Flat, final. The kind of final that told Marlowe he wasn't as certain as he sounded. "In, grab our people, out. 90 minutes on the ground, no more." "Who runs Virio now?" Hadley pushed. He had a habit of pushing. Marlowe suspected it was the only reason he was still alive, and also the reason he probably wouldn't stay that way forever. "Last I heard, half their leadership got quietly disappeared after the congressional inquiry." Marrowe's hand stilled against the edge of the podium, just for a second. A tell if you knew to look for one, and Marlowe had spent her whole life learning to look for exactly that kind of thing. Man named Dorian Kade runs field operations, Marlowe said. Former military advisor. Good reputation once. Bad exit. Bad how? Above your clearance. Marlowe's tone closed the door on it hard enough that nobody tried the handle again. He clicked to the next slide. Terrain, elevation lines, a ravine cutting between two ridges like a scar across the landscape. Insertion here. We move fast, we move quiet, and we're back on the bird before the sun's fully up. Marlowe studied the map longer than anyone else in the room. Two ridgelines, high ground on both sides of the valley floor, the kind of geometry that any competent tactician would want covered before sending 14 men walking through the bottom of it. The assignment sheet on the screen showed overwatch positions for exactly one of them. She almost raised her hand, almost said something. Because a medic pointing out tactical gaps in front of a room full of operators was a good way to get every eye in the building asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. So she said nothing. It was she would spend a long time afterward believing the worst nothing she ever said. 90 minutes. Marlowe wrote it down without needing to. She'd already memorized the terrain from the map, already clocked two ridgelines that would make excellent overwatch positions, and noted privately that nobody in this room had assigned one. She almost said something. Almost. Because that was the thing about being invisible. You saw everything. You just weren't supposed to say you'd seen it. They loaded onto the Blackhawk 40 minutes before dawn. The rotor wash flattened the grass in wide silver rings, and Marlowe pulled her med pack tight against her chest and climbed in behind Hadley, who turned around just long enough to flash her a grin that had probably worked on 100 women who weren't currently thinking about ballistic trajectories. "You're quiet," he said. Had to shout it over the engine noise. "I'm working." "On what? You're a medic. Nothing to work on till somebody's bleeding." "Everything's already working," she said. "You just don't notice it till it stops." He laughed. Didn't understand her. That was fine. She wasn't talking to him, not really. She was talking to the wind, picking up outside the open door, gauging its speed off the whip of the flag lash to a nearby vehicle before they'd even lifted off. Old habit. Her father's habit. Wind reads everything if you let it. Across from her, Captain Marlowe sat with his eyes closed, lips moving faintly. Not prayer, she didn't think. Counting something, ticking through a checklist only he could see. He opened his eyes right as the bird lifted off the tarmac, looked at her again, that same half-second. "Sinclair," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it under the engine roar. That's not a common name. Her stomach dropped somewhere around her boots. "No, sir," she said. "It's not." He studied her a moment longer. "I served with a man named Sinclair," he said. "Long time ago. Best shot I ever saw. Saved my life twice over in a place I'm not allowed to name." Marlowe's pulse climbed into her throat and stayed there. "Small world," she managed. "It's a small army," Marlowe said. "Smaller than people think." He didn't push further, didn't need to. Something had already passed between them, some current under the surface neither of them was ready to name out loud over the scream of rotor blades at 4 in the morning. He closed his eyes again, went back to counting. She watched him a moment, wondered what he wasn't saying, wondered how much of her father's disappearance lived behind that stillness he wore like armor. Because that's the thing about men who've seen too much. They don't forget faces. They don't forget names. They just learn to keep them tucked away someplace safe, someplace quiet, until the day the world drags them back out into the light whether they're ready or not. She looked out the open door instead. Watched the dark hills scroll past beneath them ridgelines like the spine of some sleeping animal, and felt that old, familiar hum settle into her chest, the one her father used to call the quiet before the work. Not fear, exactly. Readiness. The body remembering what the mind had spent years trying to forget. Below them, the valley waited, patient, empty-looking, which should have told her something all on its own because nothing in this line of work that looks empty ever actually is. and the Black Hawk carried them out over dark hills toward a valley that was already, unbeknownst to any of them, waiting to swallow the mission whole. The landing zone was quiet. Too quiet, and everybody who'd done this more than twice knew what too quiet meant, and still they went in anyway because that was the job, because 90 minutes doesn't leave room for second-guessing a silence that might just be a silence. They fanned out along the valley floor in practiced silence, boots finding rock instead of gravel, hand signals passing down the line instead of words. Marlowe stayed near the rear with Iverson medkit slung tight, eyes doing what eyes do when a body's been trained since childhood to read terrain like a sentence. Ridge left, clear line of sight to the convoy route. Ridge right, better line, better cover. If she were setting an ambush, that's where she'd sit. Patient, waiting. Nobody was watching it. She almost said something. Again. The word climbed halfway up her throat before she swallowed it back down because Iverson was beside her whispering something about the wounded contractors, about getting in and getting out clean, and the moment slid past the way moments do when you convince yourself there's still time. There wasn't. Marlowe felt it before she understood it. A pressure behind her sternum, the kind her father used to call your body doing math faster than your brain can. She grabbed Hadley's sleeve half a step before the first shot cracked across the ravine. Down! Too late. The world came apart into muzzle flashes and screaming and the particular chaos of an ambush executed by people who'd known exactly where to wait. Rounds sparked off the rocks. Somebody was shouting coordinates into a radio that wasn't getting through. Marrow was already moving, dragging a wounded operator toward cover, barking orders that cut through the noise like a blade. "This isn't militia fire pattern," he shouted. "This is coordinated. They knew!" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They knew we were coming. Marlowe pressed herself flat against a boulder, heart slamming medkit already open on instinct, hands finding a tourniquet before her mind had caught up to the fact that Hadley was down, 6 feet away, blood blooming dark through his fatigues, mouth working around words that weren't coming out right. "Stay with me," she said, low, steady, the voice she used for dying men, the one that made the dying believe for just a little while that they weren't. "Didn't see the ridge," he managed. "Nobody covered the ridge." "I know." Because she had. Because she'd known the moment she saw the map back in that briefing room with its stale coffee and its half-finished assignment sheet, and she'd let a room full of men talk over the one thing that might have kept this from happening. And now here was the cost of that silence, warm and wet under her hands, spelled out in a language that didn't need translating. Rounds kept coming. Not wild, not panic fire, measured, spaced. The rhythm of someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how to spend it. Behind her, Iverson was pressed flat against a boulder, returning fire in short, controlled bursts, shouting something about a second position, about movement on the eastern slope. Another operator went down 20 feet to her left with a sound that would live in her memory long after the rest of the details blurred together. A wet, surprised gasp. Then nothing. Never again, she thought. Whatever happens after this, never again do I stay quiet in a room like that. She worked the wound, fast, precise. 15 years of her father's discipline distilled down into hands that didn't shake even while rounds chewed the rock 6 inches from her skull. And somewhere behind her, through the smoke and the screaming, she heard Marrow's voice again, tighter, now edged with something that sounded almost like fear. "Command, this is Widow 6 Actual. We are pinned. I say again, we are pinned. Requesting immediate..." Static ate the rest. Marlowe looked up from Hadley's wound just long enough to see the ridge line above them, the one nobody had covered. And on it, for half a heartbeat, silhouetted against the gray pre-dawn sky, a shape she recognized instantly because she'd spent her whole childhood learning to become exactly that shape herself. A sniper. Set up, waiting, patient in the specific, terrible way of someone who'd done this 100 times before and had no intention of missing now. She didn't think. She moved. There's a version of this story where Marlowe Sinclair stays behind the rock, keeps her hands on Hadley's wound, keeps her head down, does exactly what a contract medic is paid to do and nothing more. Where she goes home at the end of this deployment with her secret still intact, her father's name still buried, her rifle still gathering dust in a case under her bed. That is not what happened. What happened was this. She looked at the ridge, and she looked at the 14 men bleeding and pinned in a valley that had been chosen for them, not by them, and something her father said 15 years ago in the tall grass behind a lake house rose up out of the back of her mind like it had been waiting the whole time for exactly this moment.
The truth's gonna cost you. Every time. So you make sure you're only spending it on things worth the price.
She left Hadley with a compress and a hard whispered order to hold pressure and not die on her, and she crawled flat and fast toward the fallen operator 6 meters away, whose weapon had gone silent when his arm had gone useless. His rifle. His scope. Not hers. Not marked. Not traceable back to anyone who'd know what they were looking at. She checked the wind off a strip of loose fabric snagged on a rock. 6 miles an hour, maybe 7, angling left to right across the valley floor. She checked the range the way her father had taught her, using landmarks instead of a laser because a laser gave off a signature, and signatures got you killed. A boulder at 200 meters, a dead tree at 350, the ridge itself cresting somewhere close to 420, though distance always lied a little when you were looking uphill, and she adjusted for that too, the way she'd adjusted 1,000 times before, on a range behind a lake house that didn't exist for her anymore, except in memory. Her heart was too fast. She let it slow, not by trying to slow it. That never worked, her father used to say. You didn't fight your own pulse. You waited for the gap between beats, the little pocket of stillness that existed, if you were patient enough to find it, and you lived there for exactly as long as you needed to. Somewhere behind her, chaos kept screaming. Rounds, voices, a man calling for a medic who didn't know yet that the medic he wanted was busy becoming someone else entirely. She breathed out. Not all the way, just enough. And somewhere above them on a ridge nobody had thought to cover a sniper, who had killed patiently and professionally for longer than Marlowe Sinclair had been alive, lined up his next shot on a man screaming for a medic he didn't know was already coming for him, from an angle nobody could have predicted. Marlowe fired first. The shot cracked out over the ravine, and the shape on the ridge folded sideways and did not get up, and for one suspended second, the entire valley went quiet enough to hear the brass casing hit the rock beside her elbow. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Until Marrow, 40 meters away, blood on his hands from a wound that wasn't his, turned his head slowly toward the small woman lying prone in the dirt with a rifle that wasn't hers pressed against her shoulder, and said the only thing there was left to say. "Sinclair?" She didn't answer, because there wasn't a version of the truth small enough to fit into that silence. Not yet. Not with rounds still cracking somewhere down the valley and Hadley's blood still drying under her fingernails and a dozen other men still needing her hands more than they needed her explanation. So she said the only thing that mattered. "Get your wounded moving. I've got the ridge." And Captain Elias Marrow, who had spent 20 years learning not to be surprised by anything on a battlefield, found himself for the first time in longer than he could remember completely and utterly out of certainty. Because the medic who wasn't supposed to know one end of a rifle from the other had just made a shot he wasn't sure he could have made himself. And the only name that kept surfacing in his mind, unbidden, impossible, was one he hadn't let himself say out loud in 15 years. Holt Sinclair had a daughter. He was starting to understand, with a cold and creeping certainty, exactly who had just saved his team. They got the wounded out, barely. The rescue bird came in low and hard under covering fire, and Marlowe rode the whole way back with her hands buried wrist-deep against the wound in Hadley's shoulder, holding pressure on a wound that shouldn't have let him keep as much blood as he did, and somehow stubbornly did. Nobody spoke much. 14 men who'd walked into that valley expecting a 90-minute grab, walking out with 6 wounded, some of them critically, but every single one of them still breathing, a fact none of them fully understood until hours later, when someone finally added up how many ways that valley should have killed at least a few of them, and didn't. Iverson wouldn't meet her eyes. Not out of fear, exactly, something closer to reverence and something underneath that quieter that she couldn't name yet. She didn't know it then, but that particular silence, the one where a young soldier looks at you like you've just rewritten what he thought was possible, would matter more than she could have guessed. Not for what it meant about her, for what it would come to mean about him. Marlowe sat across from her the entire flight, saying nothing, watching her work with an expression she couldn't read. When they finally touched down, when the engines began to wind toward silence and the medical teams rushed the tarmac, he caught her arm before she could climb out. "We're not done talking about this," he said. Quiet enough that it barely carried over the dying whine of the rotors. "I know," she said. "Tomorrow, my office, bring whatever paperwork you've been hiding behind that badge." She nodded because there wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't unravel the whole careful fabric of the last 2 years. And she climbed down onto the tarmac and let the medical team sweep past her toward the men who actually needed saving. Behind her, unnoticed in the chaos, one weapon lay forgotten on the deck of the helicopter, the rifle she'd fired. Not hers, marked with nothing. She'd go back for her own that night. The one that was hers, the one with her father's raven carved deep into the stock, hidden in the false bottom of her gear case where it had waited patient for 3 years for a day exactly like this one. Because somewhere out there, past the ridge line, past the valley, past a name called Vireo Solutions and a man called Dorian Kade, who Marlowe wouldn't talk about, the truth her father warned her about all those years ago was finally starting to surface. And truth he'd told her always cost something. She just didn't yet know how much of herself she was going to have to spend to pay for it. 3 weeks later, in a ravine with no name on any map, that price would come due in full, and the woman 2 medics found half-frozen and unrecognizable, clutching a rifle no one could identify, would already have paid it. She didn't sleep that night. Sat instead on the edge of her bunk with the case open on her lap, running her thumb over the raven carved into the stock the way she used to as a girl, back when the worst thing she had to worry about was whether she'd flinch on the next shot. Tomorrow, Marlowe would ask her questions she'd spent 3 years avoiding. Questions about her father, about what she knew, what she'd hidden, what she was really doing on a base 4 states away from the lake house where all of this started. She could lie again. She was good at it by now. Practiced, smooth as that river stone she'd worn her father's name down into. But some part of her, the part that had put a bullet through a man's skull from 420 meters without so much as a tremor in her hands, was tired of lying. Tired of being small on purpose. Tired of carrying a truth so heavy it had started to bend her spine without anyone noticing. "Because you're only invisible until the moment you're not," her father used to say. "And when that moment comes, girl, you'd better already know what you're going to do with it." She thought about Marlowe's face on the tarmac, the way he'd said her name like a question he already knew the answer to. She thought about Iverson's reverence and Hadley's chest rising and falling on the flight home against every reasonable expectation, and the ridge nobody had covered, and the silence she'd kept in that briefing room that had nearly cost 14 men their lives. Never again, she'd promised herself, in the middle of the chaos. She meant to keep that promise. She had no idea yet what it was going to cost her to keep it, or how far past the borders of one bad ambush her father's name was about to drag her into a company called Vireo Solutions, into the shadow of a man named Dorian Kade, into a set of secrets that had been waiting 15 years for someone stubborn enough and skilled enough and broken enough by grief to finally come looking. Somewhere beyond the base fence, past the dark tree line, the wind picked up the way it always did before something changed. She zipped the case shut, set it back beneath her bunk, and for the first time in 3 years, Marlowe Sinclair let herself believe that the truth, whatever it cost her, might finally be within reach. This was only the beginning of how she got there. Marlowe's office smelled like old paper and gun oil. 2 things that didn't belong together, and somehow always did in rooms like this, on bases like this, in the lives of people who couldn't remember the last time those 2 smells weren't part of the air they breathed. She'd been dreading this conversation all night. Rehearsed it, actually, lying in her bunk at 2 in the morning, running through every possible version of how it might go, every lie she could still tell, every truth she might finally let loose. None of the rehearsals had prepared her for how small she'd feel sitting across from him now. Marlowe sat across the desk with her hands folded and her spine straight. Because that's what you did. Because slouching gave things away, and she'd spent 3 years making sure nothing about her gave anything away. Except yesterday. Yesterday had given away everything.
I'm going to ask you a question, Marlowe said, and I want you to think very carefully before you lie to me again.
I haven't lied to you.
You told me Sinclair was a common name. It is a common name, not the way you carved a 420-meter headshot into a moving ambush with a rifle that wasn't yours.
He leaned back, let the silence stretch, watched her the way he probably watched terrain before deciding where to put his men. Holt Sinclair had a daughter. I met her once, 9 years old, maybe 10, sitting on a porch step in Montana holding a rifle bigger than she was. Marlowe's throat went tight. You remember that?
I remember everything about that deployment.
Something moved behind his eyes, old, buried, the kind of thing men like Marlowe kept in a box they didn't open on purpose.
Your father saved my life. Twice.
I was there the last time anyone saw him. The room tilted, not literally, but close enough that she gripped the arm of the chair to keep from feeling it.
You were there, she repeated,
because repeating it was the only way to make the words hold still long enough to understand them.
I was there, he said,
and I have spent 15 years telling myself there was nothing more I could have done. Some nights I even believe it.
What happened to him?
Above your clearance, he said it fast.
Automatic.
The same wall he'd put up in the briefing room, except this time his voice cracked right down the middle of it, just enough that she heard what was underneath. Guilt. Old and patient and never once given the chance to heal. I'm sorry, Marlowe. That's not me being difficult. That's the truth.
The truth costs something.
She heard her own voice say it before she'd decided to.
Her father's words, worn smooth from years of carrying them.
That's what he used to tell me. Marlowe went still. He used to say that in the field too, he said quietly. Right before he did something none of the rest of us had the stomach for. They sat with that a while. Two people who'd both lost pieces of themselves to the same disappearance, 15 years and two very different kinds of grief apart.
I want in, Marlowe said finally. Whatever this is, Vireo Solutions, Kade, whatever's actually happening under the hostage op you keep pretending this is, I want in. You're a medic. I'm his daughter.
She held his gaze and didn't blink.
You said it yourself. That should tell you everything you need to know about how much say you actually have in this.
You could get killed. I could get killed crossing the parking lot outside. She leaned forward. I've spent 15 years not knowing. Do you understand what that does to a person? Not the grief. Grief has an ending eventually, even if it takes years to reach it. This isn't grief. This is a door that never closes.
Every single day, some part of me wakes up and wonders if today's the day someone finally tells me something true.
Marlowe was quiet for a long moment. Your father used to say something similar, he said, about doors that don't close.
Then you understand why I can't walk away now.
I understand why you think you can't.
His voice softened just slightly, the first real crack in the professional distance he'd kept between them since she'd walked in.
That's not the same thing, Marlowe.
Maybe not, but it's mine to decide.
Marlowe studied her a long moment, and something in his face, reluctant, resigned, maybe even relieved, told her she'd already won this argument before she'd finished making it.
You know what the hardest part of that operation was? He said quietly, almost to himself.
Not the mission, not even losing him. It was coming home and having to look your mother in the eye and tell her nothing. Not because I didn't know things, because I knew just enough to make silence the only decent option I had left.
You could tell me now. I could tell you pieces that might get you killed faster than the truth ever would if you go looking for the rest of it without knowing what you're walking into.
He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion catching up to him all at once.
That's not me protecting a secret, Marlowe. That's me trying to protect you the only way I still know how. I don't need protecting. Everybody needs protecting. The good ones just hate admitting it. He almost smiled, tired and worn but genuine. Your father was the same way. God help us both, he said. It wasn't a yes. It was close enough. The next mission came 4 days later, and it came wrong from the start. Not wrong in the way the first one had gone wrong. Wrong in a quieter way. The kind of wrong that lives in the pit of your stomach before it ever shows up on a briefing slide. Convoy interdiction, Marlowe said, standing in front of the same terrain map, though the coordinates had shifted 70 miles east. Virio's moving something through this corridor. We don't know what. We know they don't want us finding out. Define something, Hadley said. His arm was still in a sling. He'd insisted on being there anyway, which told Marlowe everything about the kind of man he was, and also everything about the kind of man he'd need to stop being if he wanted to survive long enough to get old and tell this story to grandchildren someday. Above my clearance, too, apparently, Marlowe said, and there was an edge in it now, something sharpened by the conversation he'd had with Marlowe 4 days earlier. Which should tell all of you something. When your own command starts hiding things from you, you start asking why. Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer that wouldn't get them in trouble for asking. So we're walking in blind, Osai said from the back. Quiet man, rarely spoke. When he did, people listened. We're walking in cautious, Marlowe corrected. Sounds like blind with extra steps. Then keep your eyes open and prove me right. Marlowe sat in her usual seat, no longer in the back row. Marlowe had moved her up, hadn't said why, hadn't needed to. Everyone in that room already knew, had known since the ridge, since the shot that shouldn't have been possible from a medic who wasn't supposed to know one end of a rifle from the other. Beside her, Iverson leaned in close enough to whisper, "You look nervous." "I don't get nervous. Everybody gets nervous every single time, no matter how many missions you rack up." He studied her a second too long the way he'd started doing lately, ever since the ambush, ever since the story of what she'd done had made its way through every corner of the base, in the particular way stories do among men who live and die by each other's competence. You've been different since the mountain. Quieter. I was always quiet. Not like this. He hesitated. Something crossed his face, worry, maybe, or something adjacent to it, something that didn't quite have a name yet. You okay? Really? She almost told him the truth, almost told him about her father, about Marlowe's office, about the 4 days she'd spent lying awake, running numbers on a company called Virio Solutions that kept surfacing in every version of the story like a stain that wouldn't wash out. She didn't. I'm fine, Iverson. He nodded, didn't push, but something in his eyes stayed troubled a beat longer than it should have. And later, much later, when everything had already gone wrong in ways none of them could have predicted, she'd think back on that look and wonder what he'd already been carrying that morning that had nothing to do with her at all. She found OC in the equipment bay an hour before Wheels Up, methodically checking his gear the way some men prayed, quietly, thoroughly, without ever quite admitting that's what they were doing. He barely looked up when she came in. "You always this quiet before a mission?" she asked, mostly to fill the silence. "Talking doesn't make the gear work better." He tightened a strap, checked it twice. "My father used to say, the mouth spends courage the hands should be saving." Smart man. Dead man, actually. But smart, yeah. He said it without any visible weight to it, the way people learn to say things after enough years have sanded the edges down. "You're the one from the mountain." "I'm a medic from the mountain." "Sure." A ghost of a smile there and gone. "Whatever helps you sleep, Sinclair." She left him to his gear check, carrying that small exchange with her the rest of the day the way she seemed to be carrying every small exchange lately. Filed away, catalogued, kept close in case it mattered later. The convoy route ran through a valley that narrowed into a canyon halfway along its length. Textbook terrain for an ambush. Textbook terrain for a defense, too, if you got there first and picked your ground right.
They didn't get there first. "Contact left!" someone shouted, and the world came apart again the way it always seemed to now, fast and loud and smelling like cordite and copper. This time it was worse. This time the fire came from 3 directions instead of one, disciplined, coordinated, the kind of tactical patience that told Marlowe whoever had planned this had studied their last engagement and adjusted, learned from it. Which meant somebody on the other side had access to information they shouldn't have had. Rounds tore through the convoy vehicles in overlapping bursts. One of the supply trucks caught fire almost immediately. Black smoke curling up into a sky still gray with early morning, and somewhere in the chaos, a voice she didn't recognize was screaming for a medic in a tone that told her before she even turned toward it that she might already be too late. Which meant somebody close was talking. She didn't have time to chase that thought, didn't have time for anything except grabbing Iverson's collar and dragging him behind a burned-out supply truck as rounds chewed through the metal where his head had been a half-second earlier. "Thanks," he gasped. "Don't thank me. Move." They fell back toward a cluster of collapsed buildings at the canyon's edge, half-standing structures from some conflict decades older than this one, walls pocked with old shrapnel scars that had never quite finished healing. Good cover. Better than the open convoy road. Marlowe made the call before Marrow even gave the order, and by the time his voice crackled through the radio confirming it, half the team was already moving. "Building's compromised on the east wall," Marrow shouted. "Watch your angles." "Copy." Inside, the air was thick with dust and the particular silence that comes right before things get worse. Marlowe knelt beside a wounded operator, not Hadley this time, a quieter man named Osai, who'd barely said 10 words to her the entire deployment and started working before her brain had fully caught up with what her hands were doing. "Femoral," she muttered. "Hold pressure here. Right here. Don't let go." "I've got it," Osai gritted out, teeth clenched, and he did, hands shaking but firm, and something about the way he trusted her without question told her the story of the mountain had traveled further than she'd realized. His blood was warm against her fingers, warmer than it should have felt in air this cold. She packed the wound with practiced hands, while her mind raced somewhere else entirely, toward the ridge, toward the angles, toward the math her father had drilled into her before she'd even understood what the numbers meant. Because that was the thing about training like hers. It didn't shut off just because your hands were busy elsewhere. It ran underneath everything, always counting, always calculating, always half a step ahead of whatever the moment demanded, whether that moment called for a tourniquet or a trigger. Outside, the gunfire kept coming, kept adjusting, kept finding new angles no matter how the team repositioned, and that was the part that scared her most, more than the rounds themselves, more than the blood on her hands. Because ambushes that adapt aren't adaptees. They're hunts. She found the vantage point almost by accident. A collapsed stairwell leading up to what used to be a second floor, half its structure sheared away by decades of weather, and worse, leaving a jagged opening that looked out over the canyon like a broken window into the war itself. Perfect line of sight. Perfect elevation, and nobody covering it again because that seemed to be the pattern now, the recurring wound in every plan this unit made. And Marlowe was done being surprised by it. She climbed. Her ribs ached from the effort, some bruise from earlier she didn't have time to examine, and her hands found the crumbling stone almost on instinct, the way muscle remembers things the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. Halfway up, she stopped. Listened. Because listening was as important as climbing, her father used to say, and a soldier who forgot that usually didn't live long enough to regret it. Nothing above her, just wind moving through broken concrete, and somewhere far below, the sound of Marrow's voice, holding the line together through sheer force of will. She kept climbing. Below her, the firefight raged on, Marrow's voice cutting through the chaos in short, controlled bursts, calling positions, calling casualties, calling for support that wasn't coming fast enough. She reached the opening, dropped to her stomach, and settled the borrowed rifle against her shoulder with the same practiced calm that had carried her through the mountain 4 days before. Except this time, she wasn't hiding it anymore. This time, 12 men already knew exactly what she was. She found the first shooter through the scope, a man crouched behind rubble 200 meters out, disciplined, patient. Exactly the kind of enemy her father used to warn her about, the kind who didn't panic, the kind who waited. She waited too, breathed out, not all the way, just enough. The shot cracked across the canyon, and the man folded and didn't get up, and somewhere below her she heard Marrow's voice catch just barely before continuing on, without missing a beat. "Sinclair's got eyes on the ridge," he called out. "Reposition east, use her sight line." Just like that. No question, no hesitation. A commander who'd spent 4 days recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the quiet medic in his unit, and had apparently decided somewhere in that recalibration to simply trust what she could do, instead of wasting time being amazed by it. She found the second shooter. Then the third. Each shot steadier than the last, each breath a little more her father's and a little less her own, until she wasn't entirely sure anymore where the line between the two of them actually sat. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe there never had been. Maybe that was the whole point of everything he'd taught her all those mornings on the range, all those nights on the porch. Not to become someone separate from him. To become someone who could carry him forward when he couldn't carry himself anymore. They held the position for 40 minutes before the enemy fire finally broke off, retreating deeper into the canyon in a withdrawal too clean, too disciplined to be anything but a tactical choice rather than a defeat. "They're regrouping," Marrowe said, breathing hard, blood on his hands from a graze along his forearm he hadn't stopped to treat. "Which means they'll be back, which means we need to move before they do." He let Marlowe look at the graze while he talked, wincing but not stopping her, and for a moment the small, ordinary act of tending a wound in the middle of chaos steadied something in the room that words alone couldn't have touched. "You should have called this out sooner," she said, wrapping gauze tight around his forearm. Wasn't exactly a convenient moment. There's never a convenient moment. That's not an excuse. He almost smiled despite everything. "Your father talked to his commanding officers like this too?" "Worse, from what I hear." "Figures." He flexed his hand, testing the wrap, and something like gratitude flickered across his tired face before the mission swallowed it back up again. "Move where?" Hadley asked. "We're pinned in a canyon with no extraction window for another 2 hours. There's a communications relay half a click north." Marrowe pointed at a structure on the map that Marlowe hadn't noticed before. A squat concrete building, half buried by decades of dust and neglect. "Old signal station. If we can get eyes on it, we might be able to boost our distress call past whatever's jamming it." "Somebody's jamming us. Somebody's been jamming us since we landed." Something hardened behind Marrowe's eyes, that same tell Marlowe had learned to recognize back in the briefing room. "Which means this whole thing was planned before we ever left the base." The words settled over the group like a physical weight. Because a mole inside your own unit was one kind of problem, a mole that knew your timeline, your terrain, your comms frequency before you'd even loaded onto the aircraft. That was a different kind of problem entirely. The kind that made you look sideways at every face around you, wondering which one of them had sold the rest for money or fear or something worse. The relay station sat half underground, accessible through a rusted hatch that groaned in protest when Marrowe forced it open. The metal had gone brittle with decades of weather flaking rust onto his hands as he wrestled it upright, and for a moment the whole team stood frozen, waiting to see if the sound alone had given away their position. It hadn't. Or, if it had, nobody out there cared enough yet to respond. Inside, a narrow stairwell dropped into darkness thick enough to feel solid, and the team descended, one at a time, weapons up, breath held. Marlowe went last, rear guard, watching the door. The communications room below was smaller than she'd expected, cramped, old equipment lining the walls, most of it dead, some of it miraculously still humming with faint residual power. Marrowe worked fast, hands moving over the console with the confidence of a man who'd done this kind of improvised repair 100 times before in 100 forgotten corners of the world. "Give me 5 minutes," he muttered. Nobody spoke. The room held its breath along with him. It was Iverson who broke first, not with words, with movement, small, almost imperceptible, a shift of his weight toward the door, a glance at his watch that lasted a half-second too long. Marlowe caught it because catching things was what she did, what she'd always done, and something about the specific quality of that glance made the hair on her arms stand up. She thought back to the mess hall, to the training facility. Weeks ago now, though, it felt like a different life. "You always eat alone?" he'd asked her. "Good hands," he'd said, calm under pressure. She'd thought she was reading him. He'd been watching her too. "Iverson," she said quietly. "You good?" "Fine, too fast. Just checking the time." "Why?" He didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, in the particular stillness of a man who'd been asked a question he didn't have a rehearsed answer for, Marlowe understood something with the same cold clarity she'd felt lining up the shot on that ridge 4 days ago. He was waiting for something. "Iverson," Marrow's voice now sharp without looking up from the console. "What's on your watch?" "Nothing, sir. Show me your watch." The room went very still. Iverson's hand moved slower than it should have toward his wrist, and in that half-second of hesitation, Marlowe saw the whole truth arrive on his face at once. Fear and shame, and something underneath both of those that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a man who'd been carrying a secret so heavy that even discovery felt lighter than continuing to hold it alone. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then what is it?" His hands were shaking now, actually shaking the way they hadn't during the firefight, the way they hadn't when rounds had been cracking 6 inches from his skull an hour earlier. Some kinds of fear only surface once the shooting stops. "They have my sister," he said, barely above a whisper. "Viriel. They took her 3 weeks ago, sent me proof, said if I didn't feed them our movements, our timeline, our frequencies..." He couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. Marrow's face had gone the color of old ash. "You've been transmitting our position." "I've been trying to keep her alive." Iverson's voice cracked wide open, all the easy confidence gone, stripped down to something raw and young and terrified in a way Marlowe had never seen on him before, not even on the mountain, not even under fire. "You don't understand. They sent me a video. She was crying. She kept saying my name like she thought I could hear her, like I could just..." "Where's the device?" Marrow's voice had gone dangerously calm, the calm of a man holding something back by force of will alone. Iverson pulled it from beneath his watch face, a transmitter no bigger than a coin, its tiny light blinking a slow, patient rhythm that had, for weeks now, been broadcasting their every move to people who wanted them dead. Nobody moved to take it from him, because everybody in that room understood in the same terrible instant exactly what kind of choice this young man had been forced to make over and over every single day. And none of them, not one, could honestly say they'd have chosen any differently. "I'm sorry," Iverson whispered. "God, I'm so sorry." Marlowe knelt down in front of him, took the transmitter gently from his shaking hand. "You should have told someone," she said, not unkind, just true. "Who was I supposed to tell? Who do you trust with something like that?" His voice cracked wider, all the composure he'd built over years of training stripping away in real time. "You think I didn't consider it? Every single day I considered it. And every single day I imagined what happens to a 19-year-old girl if her brother makes the wrong call, if he trusts the wrong person, if word gets back to the people holding her that he talked. So instead, you carried it alone. What choice did I have?" "You had this one," Marrowe said quietly, stepping closer. "Right now, this moment, you could have kept lying. You didn't." Iverson looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed, disbelieving. "That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to tell you something about who you actually are, underneath the mistake you made, trying to save someone you love." Marrowe crouched down to his level, voice low, steady, the same voice he probably used on wounded men in worse situations than this one. "I've made calls in this job I still can't forgive myself for. Calls that cost people their lives. The difference between me and you right now is that you finally told the truth before it cost anyone else theirs." Marlowe didn't have an answer, because she understood better than almost anyone in that room exactly what it cost to carry a truth alone because you weren't sure anyone left standing was safe to hand it to. "We're going to fix this," she said instead. "But first you're going to tell us everything. Every message, every contact, every name." Iverson nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face, and began to talk. What he told them changed everything. Because it wasn't militia running this operation, hadn't been militia from the start. Vireo Solutions wasn't a security contractor gone rogue. It was something closer to a private army, built quietly over the better part of a decade, funded through channels that led, according to the fragments Iverson had overheard during his handler's careless calls, back to men who should have been long retired from anything resembling power. And the man running the field side of it, Dorian Kade, wasn't just a former advisor with a bad exit. He was a man who had once served alongside Holt Sinclair. "I heard the name once," Iverson said, voice still unsteady. "During a call I wasn't supposed to be listening to. Somebody mentioned Sinclair. Somebody else told them to shut up about ancient history." Marlowe's whole body went cold. "Ancient history, meaning what?" "I don't know. I swear, I don't know." Iverson looked up at her, desperate now, the desperation of a man trying to give back something worth the trust he'd broken. "But whatever it is, it's the reason they wanted this convoy hit, specifically this one. Not the last one, this one." Marrow had gone very quiet, staring at the dead equipment lining the walls like it might suddenly offer an answer none of them wanted to hear. 15 years ago, he said slowly, there was an operation, classified above anything I've ever had clearance for since. Your father was on it, Marlowe. So was I. So I'm starting to think, was Dorian Kade. What happened? I don't fully know. Nobody who was there fully knows because it was compartmentalized down to almost nothing. Separate teams, separate objectives, nobody with the whole picture. He rubbed a hand across his face. Exhaustion and old guilt tangled together into something almost unrecognizable as the composed commander she'd first met 4 days ago. But I know Kade came back from it a different man. Angrier, colder, convinced the government he'd served for 20 years had used him and thrown him away the moment he became inconvenient. Convinced how? What did they do to him? There was an inquiry, quiet one, the kind that doesn't make headlines because somebody made sure it wouldn't. Marrow's jaw worked, the words coming slower now like he was pulling them up from somewhere he'd buried on purpose. Kade got blamed for something that went wrong. Something that, from what little I ever pieced together, wasn't entirely his fault, but somebody needed a name to put on the failure, and his was convenient. He lost his commission, lost his pension, lost 20 years of service in the space of a single closed-door hearing he wasn't even allowed to attend in person. "That's not justice," Osei said quietly from where he sat propped against the wall, still pale from blood loss but listening to every word. "No," Marrowe agreed. "It wasn't. I've thought that for 15 years and never said it out loud until right now." He looked up, meeting Marlowe's eyes directly. That doesn't make what he's become right. Whatever grievance he's nursing doesn't excuse hostages' ambushes, a company built on private violence for hire. But it might explain why he's spent over a decade building something powerful enough to make the people who wronged him finally answer for it. "And my father..." Marrowe met her eyes. "Your father didn't come back at all." The silence that followed had a weight to it Marlowe could feel in her teeth. "Did Kade do something to him?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own small victory. "Is that what this is? Some kind of revenge, 15 years in the making, and my father just happened to be standing in the way of it?" "I don't know," Marrowe admitted. "I wish I did. I've wondered the same thing more nights than I'd like to count." "Then we find out." She said it flat, final, the same tone her father used to use when a decision had already been made and further discussion was just noise. "Whatever Kade knows about that operation, whatever happened to my father, we find out all of it." Nobody argued. They never got the distress call out. Not through the relay, not before Marrow's console finally sparked and died for good, and not before the enemy fire found them again, closer this time, faster. The retreat from earlier revealed for exactly what it had been, a regroup, a repositioning, a patient predator circling back for the kill. "Extraction window opens in 11 minutes, Marlowe shouted over the radio to the pickup zone, the frequency finally clear now that Iverson's transmitter sat crushed under Marlowe's boot. "We need that bird, now, not in 11 minutes. "Copy, Widow 6, working on it." Static. They ran for the landing zone through canyon shadows growing longer with the dying light. Osei, limping between two operators, Hadley favoring his bad arm but keeping pace anyway. Iverson moving like a man trying to outrun his own guilt as much as the enemy behind them. Marlowe brought up the rear again, watching, always watching. Because that was her place now, whether anyone had formally assigned it or not. The one who saw the ridge nobody else saw. The one who caught the tell in Iverson's watch. The one whose whole life had been quietly, patiently built toward exactly this moment. Though she'd never once imagined it would look like this. Running through failing light in unfamiliar terrain with a borrowed rifle and a commander who'd known her father, chasing answers that kept multiplying instead of resolving, which was how she saw them first shapes moving along the canyon rim, too many, too coordinated, cutting off the route to the landing zone before the team even reached the halfway point. "We've got company," she called out. "East Ridge, multiple hostiles." "How many?" "Enough that we're not making that LZ in a straight line." Marlow's jaw worked, calculating the particular calculation of a commander watching a clean plan collapse for the second time in one deployment. "Then we don't go in a straight line," he said. "Sinclair, you're on Overwatch. Buy us the time we need." She didn't hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury that belonged to people who hadn't already decided 4 days ago on a different ridge exactly who they were willing to become to keep the people around them breathing. The bird came in low and hot, kicking up a storm of dust and loose rock rotor wash, flattening the scrub grass in wild concentric rings. Marlowe held position on a rock outcrop 40 meters above the landing zone, laying down covering fire in disciplined bursts, while the wounded loaded first, then the rest, one after another. The chaos of extraction folding into the same rhythm she remembered from the mountain 4 days before. Osei went up first, half carried by 2 operators, his face gray with blood loss, but his eyes still tracking, still counting, the rest of the team aboard, the way soldiers do, even when they can barely stand. Then Hadley, cursing under his breath about his arm, about the dust, about anything that gave him something to focus on besides the fear plainly written across his young face. Then 2 more, and 2 more after that, the aircraft's deck filling fast, while Marlowe kept her sights trained on the ridge, picking off anything that moved with the same cold precision that had carried her through every impossible shot since the ambush that started all of this. Iverson lingered at the base of the outcrop, looking up at her like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the words for it. "Go!" she shouted down at him. "I'm right behind you." Marlowe. "Go, Iverson, that's an order, and yes, I know I don't technically outrank you, but go anyway." He went. Finally. Scrambling up into the aircraft with the last of the team, and for one brief moment Marlowe allowed herself to believe this might actually end the way it was supposed to. Clean extraction. Everybody home. A long overdue conversation with Marlowe still waiting on the other side of it, about fathers and operations and 15 years of silence finally starting to crack open. Except something was different this time. Something was wrong. "Sinclair fall back?" Marlowe's voice raw over the radio, barely audible over the engine roar. "We're wheels up in 90 seconds. Copy falling back." She never finished the sentence, because that was the moment the ground beneath her gave way. Not an explosion, nothing so dramatic, just decades of erosion finally losing its grip on rock that had held her weight 100 times already that afternoon. And suddenly, she wasn't standing on the outcrop anymore. She was falling. The world spun. Rock. Sky. Rock again. And then impact hard enough to steal the air from her lungs entirely, hard enough that for one long, terrifying moment she couldn't remember how to breathe at all. Above her, through the ringing in her ears, she heard the helicopter's engine pitch change, heard Marlow's voice, distant and frantic, shouting her name into a radio she could no longer reach, buried somewhere in the rubble beside her.
She tried to move. Pain answered before movement did, sharp, immediate, radiating from somewhere along her ribs that told her something in there had broken on impact. She tried again, anyway, because lying still wasn't a choice. Not with a helicopter 30 seconds from a departure window it couldn't afford to miss, not with enemy shapes still moving along that ridge, not with 11 other people counting on the fact that whatever else Marlowe Sinclair was, she wasn't someone who quit halfway through a fight. She got one hand under herself, then the other, pushed up through pain sharp enough to white out the edges of her vision, and looked up just in time to see the helicopter lifting off the landing zone below, exactly on schedule, exactly as ordered. Without her. For one impossible second, she thought she saw a face pressed against the open door. Iverson, maybe, or Hadley, someone straining against the wind to look back toward where she'd been standing seconds before. She couldn't tell for certain. Distance and dust and the failing light stole the details, left her only with the shape of a helicopter growing smaller against a darkening sky and the sound of its engine fading into a silence that felt bottomless. She tried the radio anyway, found it crushed beneath a slab of stone, its casing cracked clean through, whatever was left of it useless now except as a reminder of how completely, suddenly alone she'd become. No, she said out loud to no one, to the canyon, to the mountain that had cost her father 15 years ago, and now seemed intent on collecting from her too. No, no, no. She almost laughed. Almost. Because there was something absurd about it, something almost cruel in its precision. The daughter of Holt Sinclair left behind in hostile terrain, exactly the way her father had been left behind, exactly the way she'd spent 15 years refusing to believe could happen twice to the same family, except it had. She forced herself upright, using the shattered stairwell wall for support, breath coming ragged and shallow around ribs that screamed with every inch of movement. Below, in the deepening shadows of the canyon floor, she could still see shapes moving. Patient. Unhurried. The kind of unhurried that told her whoever commanded them already knew the aircraft was gone and knew exactly what that meant for the woman left standing in its wake. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Later, much later, after everything that came next, after the days in the wilderness that would leave her half-frozen and unrecognizable in a ravine with no name on any map, Marlowe would try to remember whether she'd screamed as the aircraft rose, whether she'd called out, whether some part of her had genuinely believed in that first raw second that they'd turn back for her. She never could remember clearly. What she remembered instead was the silence that followed. The particular, complete silence of a canyon after a helicopter's engine fades into distance, after gunfire stops, after every other human sound in the world simply withdraws and leaves you alone with your own heartbeat and the growing dark. She remembered thinking absurdly of her father on the porch that night years ago, cleaning a rifle that was already clean, telling her that everyone who does this work is scared every single time and that the ones who say otherwise are either lying or already dead inside. She wasn't dead inside. Not yet. She checked what she had left, the borrowed rifle, half a magazine remaining, a med kit stripped down to almost nothing after Osei's wound had taken most of what she'd carried in. No radio, no water beyond a single canteen already half empty, and ribs that ground together with every breath in a way that told her with clinical certainty that whatever came next would have to happen through pain she couldn't afford to acknowledge yet. She thought about the operation Marrowe had described. 15 years old, compartmentalized down to nothing. Her father on one team, Marrowe on another, and somewhere in that fractured, half-remembered history, a man named Dorian Kade, who had lost everything and decided somewhere in the wreckage of that loss to build something powerful enough to make the world answer for it. She thought about Iverson's sister, about the transmitter crushed under her boot, about a young man who'd betrayed his team not out of malice but out of love twisted sideways by fear, and how easily any one of them might have made the same terrible choice in his position. She thought about her mother back in Montana, who still didn't know her daughter had followed her husband's footsteps this far into danger, who still believed, as far as Marlowe knew, that her only child was working some quiet contract job stateside, safe, ordinary.
Nothing at all like the girl who used to field strip rifles behind a lake house at 8 years old. She thought too about the letter she'd write if this went the wrong way. The one she'd never actually write because writing it felt too much like giving the canyon permission to win. But the shape of it existed anyway, somewhere, in the back of her mind, the way her father's own unspoken letters must have existed in his, all those years he'd sat on a porch, cleaning a rifle that was already clean. Maybe that was the cruelest part of what he'd left her. Not the grief. The inheritance of exactly how it felt to walk into danger carrying words for the people you loved that you hoped desperately you'd never actually have to send. But somewhere in that canyon, watching the last light drain out of a sky that didn't care one way or the other whether she survived the next 72 hours, Marlowe Sinclair understood with total clarity that she was now completely, utterly alone. Injured, unarmed, except for a borrowed rifle she'd need to make last far longer than its magazine allowed, and stranded in territory controlled by a man who might hold the last answers to a question she'd been carrying for 15 years. Dorian Kade was out there somewhere. And for the first time since this had all started, Marlowe realized the truth wasn't something she was chasing anymore. It was something that was about to come looking for her instead. She checked the rifle one final time in the failing light, counted what remained of her strength, the way her father had taught her to count everything honestly, without flattering herself, without pretending the numbers were better than they actually were. Half a magazine. Cracked ribs, no radio, no backup, and somewhere out there moving through the dark with the patience of men who already believed the fight was over, the answer to 15 years of questions was finally terribly close enough to reach. She started walking. Because whatever came next, she was done being the daughter who waited quietly for someone else to bring her the truth. She was going to go find it herself. Behind her, the canyon settled into full dark, and somewhere far above, indifferent to all of it, the same stars her father used to name for her from a porch in Montana kept burning the way they always had, long before either of them existed, and long after whatever happened next in this valley would matter to anyone but her. The cave wasn't much. A shallow overhang carved into limestone by centuries of water that had long since found somewhere else to go, barely deep enough to keep the wind off her back and the worst of the cold from finding her bones directly. It would have to be enough. Because enough was all she had left to work with. Enough rifle, enough strength, enough of her father's voice still echoing somewhere behind her ribs to keep her moving when every reasonable part of her wanted to simply lie down in the dark and stop. She didn't lie down. The first night was the worst. Cold enough that her breath crystallized in front of her face, even inside the overhang cold enough that she caught herself losing track of time, of sequence, of the difference between memory and the present moment. She kept hearing her father's voice, clear as if he were sitting right beside her in the dark. Stay awake. Stay moving. The mountain doesn't care if you're tired. She built a fire small enough not to be seen from the canyon floor, using techniques that had nothing to do with any manual and everything to do with a girl who used to camp with her father in the Montana backcountry every summer until she could build shelter blindfolded, start flame from wet wood, read a mountain's moods the way other kids read faces. That girl was still in here somewhere. She was going to need her. 3 days. That's how long it took Marlowe to understand the terrain around her well enough to move through it without being seen. 3 days of rationing water she didn't have enough of, treating ribs she couldn't properly splint, watching patrols move through the canyon below with the patient, methodical thoroughness of men who knew exactly what they were hunting and had all the time in the world to find it. She didn't run. Running was what prey did, what her father used to call the last mistake a wounded animal makes, the one that turns a possible escape into a certain kill, because motion is the thing predators are built to notice first. So she waited. She watched. She learned the patrol patterns the way she used to learn wind patterns off her father's shoulder, cataloging timing, spacing, the small human tells that separated disciplined operators from men just going through motions. And on the third night, when the patrol pattern finally showed her the gap she'd been waiting for, she moved. The only route toward the compound ran through a river swollen with recent rain, cold enough that the first touch of it against her skin nearly stole what little breath her cracked ribs still allowed her. She stood on the bank a long moment, weighing the risk against the alternative, a longer route through open ground that patrols swept twice a night with no cover and no margin for a mistake. The river was the better bet. She waded in slowly, rifle held high above her head, the current tugging at her legs with a strength that made her understand, in a way, no amount of childhood swimming lessons ever had, exactly how much smaller she was than the water around her. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a stone slicked with algae, and for one heart-stopping second the current nearly took her fully off her feet, ribs screaming as she twisted to keep the rifle dry and her head above the surface. She thought of her father again. Of a summer afternoon on Flathead Lake when she was 9, terrified of the deep water off the dock, and him standing waist-deep beside her, saying calm as anything, "The water doesn't care if you're scared. It only cares if you keep moving." She kept moving. She reached the far bank, soaked through and shaking, teeth chattering hard enough to ache, but across. Alive, rifle dry, and close enough now, finally, to see the faint glow of compound lights through the trees ahead. Toward the compound, not away from it. Because somewhere inside those walls sat the only man alive who might actually know what happened to Holt Sinclair 15 years ago, and Marlowe had decided, somewhere in the cold hours of that third night, that she was done letting other people decide when she got to hear the truth. The compound sat in a valley that had probably once been beautiful before someone had ringed it in razor wire and guard towers and turned what might have been a farming settlement into something closer to a fortress. Vireo Solutions didn't advertise, didn't need to. The kind of men who worked there already knew exactly what kind of company they'd signed on to, and the kind of secrecy that surrounded it told Marlowe everything about how carefully its founder had built this thing to survive scrutiny. She found the perimeter gap exactly where 3 nights of patrol watching had told her it would be. Slipped through in the narrow window between rotations, moving low and fast across open ground, with pain lancing through her ribs at every step, every breath a negotiation between necessity and agony. Inside the compound was quieter than she'd expected, fewer men than the fortifications suggested. Which told her something, too, that whatever Kade was building here, he was still building it still short of the numbers his ambition clearly required. She found the command building by process of elimination, the only structure with real security around it, the only one with lights burning at an hour when everything else on the base had gone dark. She found a side entrance. Found it unlocked, which should have worried her more than it did, except by that point, exhaustion and pain and 15 years of waiting had worn her caution down to something thin and sharp instead of careful. She stepped inside and found herself in a room lined with photographs, dozens of them. Old, some faded almost to nothing, others sharper, more recent. Men in uniform, men in civilian clothes standing in front of buildings she didn't recognize in countries she couldn't name. And in the center of it all, pinned like the heart of some terrible shrine, a single photograph that stopped her breath entirely. Her father, younger than she remembered him, standing beside a man she didn't recognize, tall, sharp-jawed, a confidence in his posture that hadn't yet curdled into whatever he'd become since. Both of them smiling, both of them looking like men who trusted each other completely, the way soldiers do when they've bled for each other and lived to laugh about it afterward. She stepped closer, reached out despite herself, fingers hovering just above the photograph's surface without quite daring to touch it. 15 years she'd carried a version of her father, frozen at 42, gray already threading through his temples, weight of 2 decades of service written into every line of his face. This man in the photograph looked lighter somehow, younger, not just in years but in something harder to name before whatever happened to him had happened, before the world had finally asked more of him than any one man should reasonably be expected to give. Beside that photograph hung others she didn't immediately understand. Maps annotated in handwriting she didn't recognize, newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, reporting vague stories about contractor investigations that never seemed to reach any real conclusion. A folder thick with what looked like personnel records, stamped in red ink she couldn't read from this distance. A shrine, she realized, not to grief alone. To an unfinished argument 15 years old, one man still fighting it long after everyone else had been told to stand down. "You look like him." The voice came from behind her, calm, unhurried, entirely unsurprised to find an intruder standing in the middle of his private gallery of grief. Marlowe turned. Dorian Kade stood in the doorway, older than the photograph, grayer, a scar tracing down one side of his jaw that hadn't been there 15 years ago, and eyes that held something Marlowe recognized instantly because she'd spent years learning to recognize it in the mirror. Grief that had never been allowed to finish. "You knew I was coming," she said. "I knew someone was coming the moment my perimeter reported an unauthorized gap in patrol timing 3 nights running." He stepped further into the room, unarmed, hands loose at his sides in a way that felt less like surrender and more like a man who genuinely didn't consider her a threat worth drawing a weapon over. "I didn't know it would be his daughter."
"You knew my father."
"I served with your father for 11 years. Watched him save more lives than any medal ever accounted for." Something moved across Kade's face, not quite warmth, but something adjacent to it, weathered down by time into a shape that was harder to read. "He was the best man I ever served beside, which is precisely why what happened to him should never have happened at all." Marlowe's hands were shaking, not from fear, from something closer to the edge of an answer she'd waited 15 years to reach. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened to him." Kade moved to a chair near the wall and sat slowly, the way men sit when old wounds make every motion a negotiation. He gestured toward another chair. Marlowe didn't take it. She wasn't ready to sit down for this. 15 years ago, your father and I ran a joint operation neither of us had asked for, Kade said, compartmentalized so heavily that even the men executing it barely understood the full scope of what we were actually doing. That's how they wanted it. Fewer questions, fewer complications. Doing what? Officially securing a weapons cache before it fell into the wrong hands. His mouth twisted, something bitter and old surfacing beneath the words. Unofficially, we were covering for a contractor relationship that had gone catastrophically wrong. Weapons that were never supposed to exist on paper sold through channels that were never supposed to exist either. And when the deal collapsed, someone needed the whole mess to simply disappear. And my father found out. Your father always found out. That was the thing about him, you couldn't put anything past him for long. The old scar along Kade's jaw pulled taut as his mouth set into a hard line. He refused to sign off on the cover story. Said the men who died in that collapsed deal deserved better than a clean report that erased what actually happened to them. He was going to talk. Formally, on the record, to people who could actually do something about it. So they killed him. They tried to kill both of us. Kade's voice cracked just slightly, the first genuine fracture in his composure since she'd walked in. I got out. Barely. Your father held the extraction point so the rest of the team could clear the area. Told me he'd be right behind us. The room went very quiet. He wasn't, Marlowe said. It wasn't a question. He wasn't. Kade closed his eyes, and for one unguarded moment, Marlowe saw exactly how much this had cost him. 15 years of carrying a truth heavy enough to reshape everything he'd built afterward. I went back for him, twice. Both times I was pulled out by force before I could reach the extraction point. By the time I finally got clearance to return with a proper team, there was nothing left to find. No body, no trace. Just a story the government decided to write for us. One that made his loyalty look like negligence and buried the real reason he died under a mountain of classification stamps. Missing, Marlowe whispered. Presumed, classified. Those words cost me everything I had left to give a damn about, Kade said. My commission, my pension, 20 years of service erased in a closed hearing because I refused to stop asking who actually gave the order that got your father killed, and because asking that question too loudly made powerful people very uncomfortable. You could have told someone, told me, eventually, told the world. I tried. Something raw broke through his voice, old frustration finally finding an outlet after 15 years of silence.
I filed reports. I testified where they'd let me testify. Every single time the same walls went up. Classified, above your clearance, national security. I watched the machinery that killed your father protect itself over and over, and I decided if the truth couldn't get through the front door, I'd build something powerful enough to kick it down.
That's not justice. That's revenge wearing justice's clothes. Kade flinched at that visibly, the words landing somewhere old and unhealed. Marlowe stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by photographs of men who'd built and lost and rebuilt their entire lives around a single, terrible day, and felt something inside her chest finally, quietly break open. Not shatter, break open. The way a wound finally does when it's been closed wrong for too long and needs to be reopened properly before it can actually heal. "Why the ambushes?" she said. "Why the hostages? The convoy attacks, all of it? If this is about my father, about justice for what happened to him, it stopped being about justice a long time ago," Kade admitted, and something in his voice sounded almost relieved to finally say it out loud to someone who might actually understand. "Justice was the reason I started. Power became the reason I continued. Somewhere along the way I convinced myself that if I built something large enough, dangerous enough, I could finally force the people who erased your father to answer for it publicly. And instead, you became exactly the kind of thing he died trying to stop." The words landed harder than she'd intended. Harder maybe than she'd known she believed them, until she heard herself say them out loud. Kade's composure cracked wide open at that. A man who'd faced down gunfire and betrayal and 15 years of grief without visibly breaking undone by 6 words from a 27-year-old woman standing in the wreckage of his private shrine to guilt. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "Then stop. It's not that simple anymore. It never is. That doesn't mean it isn't still the right thing to do." Marlowe stepped closer, ribs screaming with every movement, exhaustion and grief and 15 years of unanswered questions all colliding into something that felt, finally, like clarity. "My father died refusing to let a cover-up stand. You spent 15 years building an empire on the same lie you claim to be avenging. Tell me how that honors him. Tell me how any of this, the hostages, the ambushes, Iverson's sister, tell me how any of that is what he'd have wanted from the man he trusted enough to die covering his retreat." Kade said nothing for a long time. Outside gunfire erupted, not the disciplined, patient fire of a patrol. Chaotic, urgent, the unmistakable sound of a compound realizing all at once that it was under attack from an unexpected direction. Kade was on his feet instantly, all the weathered grief replaced by decades of trained reflex. "That's not my men. Whose is it? I don't know." He moved to the window, peering out through gaps in old blinds, and whatever he saw there made his face go pale in a way 15 years of guilt hadn't managed. "Unless—" The door burst open, and Marrowe stood in the frame, weapon raised, blood on his uniform that wasn't entirely his, flanked by Iverson and 2 operators Marlowe didn't recognize, all of them looking like men who'd fought their way through half a compound to reach this exact room. "Sinclair." Marrowe's voice cracked with something that sounded impossibly like relief. "You're alive." "Mostly," she managed. His eyes moved past her to Kade, and something ancient and complicated passed across his face. Recognition, old grief, and underneath it all, a fury that had clearly been waiting 15 years for exactly this moment. "Dorian," Marlowe said. Just the name, it carried more weight than any accusation could have. "Elias." Kade didn't reach for a weapon, didn't move at all. "You found her. We've been looking for 3 days. Marrow's weapon didn't waver, though something in his stance suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to do with it. "Your men have been hunting her the same 3 days. Which one of those facts do you want to explain first? I called them off 2 hours ago," Kade said. "Ask your daughter, Elias. She's about to tell you the same thing I just told her." Marrow's eyes flicked to Marlowe, question written plainly across his exhausted face. "He didn't kill my father," she said. "The people who erased my father's death, who buried the truth about what actually happened, those are the people responsible.
Cade's spent 15 years chasing the wrong kind of justice for the right reason, but he didn't do this.
That doesn't excuse the hostages, Marrowe said. The ambushes, Iverson's sister. No, Kade said quietly. It doesn't, I know that. Iverson stepped forward, weapon still raised, jaw tight with 3 weeks of terror and guilt, finally finding a target to aim it at. You had my sister locked up for 3 weeks. You made me betray my own team. You don't get to just say, I know that, and expect it to mean anything. You're right, Kade said, and he didn't flinch away from the accusation, didn't try to soften it. It doesn't mean anything on its own. Actions are the only currency that ever meant anything in this line of work. I'm offering mine. Take me to federal custody. Let the compound's records speak. Where is she? Iverson's voice cracked. My sister! Where is she? Kade turned toward him, something shifting in his weathered face. Not quite guilt, but close enough to it that Marlowe found herself, despite everything, almost believing what came next. Building 4. Unharmed. I gave the order to keep her that way from the beginning. He held up both hands, slowly showing them empty. I'm not proud of using her as leverage. I told myself it was necessary. I've told myself a great many things were necessary these past 15 years. Take me to her. I will. Right now, if that's what ends this standoff peacefully. Kade looked between Marrowe's weapon and Marlowe's exhausted, unarmed stance, and something like resignation settled over his features. The weight of a decade and a half finally coming due all at once. I'm tired, Elias. God help me, I am so tired of being the man I became. If ending this means facing whatever comes next, I'd rather face it than keep building something I no longer recognize as justice. They found Iverson's sister exactly where Kade said she'd be, frightened, thin, but unharmed, and the reunion that followed was the kind of moment Marlowe found herself turning away from out of simple respect for its rawness. A young man on his knees in a locked room holding his sister like he might never let go again, both of them sobbing in a language of relief that needed no translation. Marlowe stepped back into the hallway to give them privacy. Marrowe found her there, leaning against the wall, ribs finally allowed to ache without the adrenaline of confrontation masking the worst of it. You should be in a hospital, he said. Probably. Definitely. He studied her a long moment, exhaustion and something warmer, both written across his tired face. Your father would be proud of you. I hope you know that. Whatever else happened today, whatever comes next with Kade and the fallout from all this, he would be proud. Marlowe felt something in her chest give way gently this time. Nothing like the harder break from Cade's office, just relief. Just the quiet unlocking of a door that had been sealed for 15 years. I know, she said, and for the first time since 2 men in dress uniforms had walked up a gravel driveway in Montana, she actually believed it. The extraction came at dawn. Not a rescue, exactly. Kade himself made the call to federal authorities before the sun fully cleared the ridgeline, surrendering the compound and everything in it, including records that would eventually unravel 15 years of buried classification and finally force the truth about Holt Sinclair's death into daylight, where it belonged. It wouldn't be simple. Marrowe told her that plainly, on the ride out, exhaustion evident in every word. There would be hearings, depositions. Powerful people who'd spent 15 years protecting a lie would spend considerably more effort trying to protect it now that unraveling would cost them everything. But it would happen. Because Marlowe Sinclair had learned across 3 brutal days in a wilderness that had nearly killed her exactly how much her father's teachings were worth when they mattered most. The truth costs something. Every time. And she had decided somewhere in that canyon with a borrowed rifle and half a magazine of ammunition that she was finally willing to pay whatever it demanded. A little over 2 weeks later, she almost didn't survive paying it. The infection had set in slowly, the way these things do, an untreated wound from the fall in the canyon, finally catching up with a body that had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness far longer than any body reasonably should. She'd insisted on staying in the field during the initial fallout from the compound's collapse, helping coordinate the search for records, refusing the medical leave everyone kept telling her she desperately needed. By the time the fever hit hard enough to drop her, she was 3 miles from the nearest outpost, alone, having insisted on walking a perimeter check that nobody had actually assigned her. She remembered very little of what came next. Fragments, cold, the particular clarity that sometimes arrives right before consciousness gives out entirely, her hand finding her father's rifle without her mind quite deciding to reach for it. Some instinct, older than thought, pulling it close, the way it had pulled her through every impossible moment of the past month. She remembered thinking distantly that if this was how it ended, at least it would end with his rifle in her hands instead of some borrowed weapon that meant nothing. And then, nothing at all. "Got a live one," the medic called out. His name was Grady, 22 years in the field, and he'd learned to say things flat. The flight to the field hospital passed in fragments, the rhythmic thud of rotor blades, someone's hands pressing against wounds she couldn't feel anymore, a voice repeating her name like an anchor thrown into water too deep to swim. She surfaced and sank, the fever burning through whatever reserves of strength 3 weeks in hostile terrain and a canyon fall hadn't already stripped away. At some point, distantly, she heard someone say the word critical. At some point after that, she stopped hearing anything at all. She woke slowly, the way people wake from very deep water, sound arriving before sight, sensation arriving before understanding. Antiseptic. The particular hum of medical equipment, a blanket heavier and warmer than anything she remembered from the wilderness. There she is, Marrow's voice, close. Relieved in a way that told her before she'd even fully opened her eyes exactly how close this had been. "How long?" she managed. Her voice came out, cracked, barely her own. "4 days since we found you. A little over 2 weeks since the compound." He leaned into her field of view, older somehow than she remembered, though it had only been a month. "You scared the hell out of everyone, Sinclair." "Wasn't exactly the plan." "With you, it never is." Something warm broke through his exhaustion, the ghost of a real smile. "Iverson's outside, refuses to leave, says it's the least he can do after everything." "He didn't have to do that." "Try telling him that. He's been sitting in that hallway chair for 2 days straight. Nurses had to physically make him go eat something yesterday." Marrow's smile faded into something more serious. "He's not the same kid he was before all this, Marlowe. None of us are, I suppose, but him especially." "Is he doing okay? Really?" "Getting there. His sister's helping. So is knowing you'd forgiven him before he even asked for it." Marlowe paused, watching her carefully. "You want to see him?" "In a minute." She managed a weak smile of her own. "Let me finish being annoyed at you for scaring me about how long I was out first." "Fair enough." He almost laughed, the sound rusty from disuse in the way laughter always is after weeks of nothing but grim news. "And his sister?" Marlowe asked. "Safe. Staying with their aunt in Ohio while the depositions get sorted out." He paused, something more serious settling over his features. "The investigation's moving faster than anyone expected." Kade's testimony combined with the records from the compound, it's already forcing hearings nobody thought would ever happen. "Your father's name is finally part of the official record, Marlowe. Not as a footnote, not as classified, as what actually happened." Her eyes burned, sudden and fierce, 15 years of grief finally finding somewhere honest to land. "He'd have wanted it done right," she whispered. "Not fast, right. It's being done right," Marlowe said. "I promise you that." The rifle sat on the table beside her hospital bed, clean, and returned by someone thoughtful enough to know exactly what it meant to her. She reached for it slowly, ribs still protesting every movement, and ran her thumb across the raven carved into the stock, the way she had 1,000 times before, a physical anchor to a father she'd spent 15 years trying to understand well enough to finally let go of some of the weight he'd left behind. "There's something else," Marlowe said carefully. "Something the investigators found in Kade's compound. A letter. Your father wrote it the week before the operation that killed him, addressed to you. Kade told them he'd carried it out of the extraction site himself, along with what little else survived, said he never had the courage to deliver it once the cover-up buried everything else along with it. He handed her an envelope worn soft with age, her name written across the front, in handwriting she recognized instantly, despite 15 years of not seeing it. Her hands shook as she opened it. You don't have to read it now, Marrowe said gently, if you're not ready. I've been ready for 15 years, she said. I just didn't know it until this exact moment. He nodded, understanding, and stepped back toward the door to give her the privacy this deserved. Before he left, he paused. For what it's worth, he said, I think he'd be glad it finally reached you, even 15 years late, especially 15 years late maybe. Some things are worth the wait if the alternative is never at all. Then he was gone, and Marlowe was alone with the last words her father had ever written her. If you're reading this, something's gone wrong enough that I'm not the one explaining it to you myself. I've thought about how to say what I need to say for longer than I should have, and I still don't think I've found the right words, so I'm just going to say it plainly, the way you always liked things said. I love you, more than I've ever managed to say out loud. I taught you everything I knew about surviving because I needed you to be able to protect yourself in a world I understood better than I wanted to. I never taught you enough about how to be happy in that same world, and I regret that more than almost anything. Whatever happens to me, don't spend your life chasing my ghost. Chase your own truth instead. Build something that's actually yours. The rifle is yours now, if it's found its way to you. Not as a weapon, as a promise that some things get carried forward even when the person who carried them first can't anymore. I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. I hope you already knew that, but in case you didn't, now you do. Marlowe sat with the letter a long time, tears falling freely now. 15 years of grief and searching, finally arriving at something that felt impossibly like peace. He knew, she whispered. He knew something might happen. He wrote this before he even left. She read it again, then a third time, memorizing the shape of each sentence, the way she used to memorize wind patterns and range calculations, because some things deserved to be carried in memory as well as on paper, safe from the possibility of ever being lost again. Build something that's actually yours, he'd written. She thought about what that might mean, now that the mission that had defined the last 2 months of her life was finally, officially over. Not a return to the quiet anonymity of contract medicine hiding a name and a skill set behind fatigues 2 sizes too practical for anyone to notice twice. Something new. Something that honored the parts of him worth carrying forward without simply becoming a smaller, sadder echo of his unfinished war. She didn't know yet what that would look like. For the first time in 15 years, she found she wasn't afraid of not knowing. When Marrowe returned to check on her an hour later, he found her asleep, the letter still held loosely in one hand, the rifle resting across her lap, exactly the way her father used to hold it on quiet nights on a porch overlooking a lake neither of them would ever fully leave behind. He didn't wake her, just pulled the blanket a little higher, set the letter carefully on the nightstand where she'd find it again when she woke, and stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to, thinking about a promise made 15 years ago, in a place he still couldn't fully talk about. Finally, after everything, kept. 2 weeks after the hospital released her, Marlowe drove to Montana. She hadn't told her mother she was coming. Some part of her had wanted to, had picked up the phone a dozen times in the days leading up to the drive, and every time some older, more stubborn part of her had set it back down instead. Some things needed to be said in person or not said at all. The lake house looked smaller than she remembered. That was the thing nobody warned you about growing up, how the places that once contained your entire universe eventually shrank down to something you could hold in 2 hands once you'd seen enough of the wider world to have something to measure them against. Ruth was in the garden when Marlowe pulled into the gravel drive, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, gray now, threading through hair that used to be the same brown as Marlowe's own. She looked up at the sound of tires on gravel, and for a moment neither of them moved. Two women separated by a stretch of lawn and 15 years of a silence that had finally broken. Then Ruth was on her feet, trowel forgotten in the dirt, crossing the yard faster than a woman her age should have been able to move.
"You're limping,"
Ruth said before she'd even reached her, before hello, before anything else. Some things mothers just knew. Old injury, mostly healed. Mostly. Ruth's hands found Marlowe's face, cupped it the way she used to when Marlowe was small enough to be held that way. Checking for something only a mother's eyes could verify. "You look like hell, baby. You should see the other guy." It was meant as a joke. It landed somewhere heavier than that, and Ruth's eyes filled before either of them could stop it, and then they were both crying in the middle of the driveway. The kind of crying that had been building for 15 years and finally found somewhere safe enough to let go. They sat on the back porch that evening, the same porch where Holt used to clean a rifle that was already clean, watching the same lake go dark and flat and silver under the same wide sky full of stars. Ruth had made coffee, neither of them drank, the mugs going cold on the railing between them, while Marlowe told her everything. The mountain, the canyon, Kade, the letter, all of it, in the plain, unadorned language her father had always preferred to anything fancier.
"He wrote you a letter,"
Ruth said quietly when Marlowe finally reached that part. She said it as a statement, not a question. Something in her voice suggested she'd half known or hoped that something like it might exist somewhere, waiting. He did. "Can I read it?" Marlowe had brought it with her, folded, soft with handling, into her jacket pocket, the way she carried it everywhere now, and she passed it over without a word, watching her mother's hands shake as she unfolded paper that had waited 15 years to reach the people it was written for. Ruth read it twice, then sat with it a long time silent, the porch light catching the tears tracking down a face that had aged 15 years, waiting for exactly this. "That's him," she said finally. "That's exactly him. Even the handwriting, even the way he never quite finished a sentence the way you expected him to." "I miss him," Marlowe said.
Simple.
True. The kind of sentence that didn't need decorating. "I know, baby. I do too. Every single day." Ruth folded the letter carefully back along its original creases, handed it back like something sacred. "But you know what I keep thinking? Watching you sit there? He's not entirely gone. Not really. I look at you and I see so much of him, it takes my breath sometimes." I don't know if that's a compliment or a warning. Both, probably. It usually was with him too. Ruth almost smiled, the first real one Marlowe had seen from her in 15 years. "Stay a few days, please. I've missed you more than you know, and this house has been too quiet for too long." Marlowe stayed 5 days. Long enough to fix the porch step that had been loose since before her father disappeared. Long enough to sleep in her old room and wake up disoriented for a moment each morning, expecting to hear him already up and moving around the kitchen downstairs. Long enough to understand that grief and healing weren't opposites the way she'd always assumed. They were just two names for the same slow work done a little at a time in a house that finally felt like it belonged to the living again instead of only to the missing. She left on the 6th morning, with her mother's arms wrapped tight around her on the gravel drive, both of them crying again, though this time the tears felt different. Lighter. Earned, somehow, instead of merely endured. "Come back soon," Ruth said, "and bring that captain of yours next time. The one who called to check on you every day you were in the hospital. Don't think I didn't notice." Marlowe felt heat rise in her face despite herself. "It's not like that." "Sure it isn't." Ruth's smile this time held something almost mischievous, a flash of the woman she'd been before grief had worn her down to something quieter. "Your father was terrible at hiding things too. Runs in the family, apparently." Marlowe drove away with that thought trailing her the whole way back east, unexpected and warm and entirely unprepared for. The reunion happened a month later in a quiet ceremony hall that had seen 100 homecomings before this one, and would see 100 more after. Marlowe stood outside the entrance a long moment before going in, smoothing the front of a dress uniform jacket that still felt unfamiliar on her frame, more accustomed to medic fatigues than anything with polish on the buttons. Her ribs had healed enough now to stop aching with every breath, though the doctors had warned her the deeper wound, the one that had nearly cost her life to infection, would take longer to fully mend than any bone ever had. Some wounds always did. 14 men stood in a loose formation as Marlowe walked in, still moving carefully around ribs that hadn't fully healed, still carrying more weight than any 27-year-old should have to carry. The men she'd saved on that first mountain, finally given the chance to properly meet the woman whose identity had remained a mystery for weeks after the extraction that saved every one of their lives. One of them stepped forward first, older, steady eyes that had clearly seen more than his share of impossible moments. "We never got your name," he said. "After the mountain. You were gone before anyone could ask." "Marlowe Sinclair." Sinclair. Recognition flickered across his face, the same recognition Marrow had shown weeks earlier in a Blackhawk at 4 a.m.
Any relation to his daughter, she said. And for the first time in 15 years, the words came out without hesitation, without a practiced lie ready to follow them. "Yes, I'm his daughter."
The man studied her a long moment, something like understanding settling over his weathered features. "Explains a lot," he said quietly. "That shot on the ridge, nobody's ever seen anything like it. We've spent weeks trying to figure out how a medic pulled off something that should have been impossible. I had a good teacher. Must have been one hell of a teacher. He was," Marlowe said, and this time when the grief rose up, it came gentler than it had in years, softened by something that felt unmistakably like pride instead of only loss. One by one, the rest of the men introduced themselves, each handshake carrying its own small weight of gratitude that words never quite managed to fully express. A father of 3 who'd have missed his daughter's next birthday if that shot hadn't found its mark, his voice thick when he tried to explain what that meant and gave up halfway through, settling instead for simply gripping her hand and nodding. A young corporal, barely older than Iverson, still visibly rattled by how close that mountain had come to ending everything, who told her he'd started sleeping better once he learned there was a name attached to the person who'd saved him, that the not knowing had somehow been its own kind of unfinished wound. A grizzled team leader who simply gripped her hand a beat longer than necessary and said nothing at all because some things didn't need saying. The last man in line held back until nearly everyone else had spoken, a quiet, watchful presence Marlowe recognized from the mountain, even though they'd never formally met. "You checked my pulse," he said finally, "in the chaos. I don't even remember it happening, but my buddy told me after, said you stopped mid-firefight to make sure I was still breathing before you moved on to the ridge." "I don't remember that specifically," Marlowe admitted. "There was a lot happening." "I remember it," he said simply. "I think about it more than I probably should. Somebody who didn't know me from anyone else in that valley took 2 extra seconds to make sure I lived in the middle of everything else falling apart." He shook his head slightly, something humbled and grateful crossing his weathered face. "Don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank you for that. Figured I should at least try." "You just did," Marlowe said quietly. He nodded, satisfied, and stepped back to rejoin the others. Marrow watched from near the doorway, Iverson beside him, both of them wearing the particular expression of men who understood exactly how rare a room like this one actually was. 14 lives still breathing, gathered in one place because a woman nobody had properly thanked finally got the chance to hear it in person. That evening, alone at the edge of the ceremony grounds, Marlowe knelt in the grass and set her father's rifle carefully across her knees, the same way she'd seen him do 100 times on that porch overlooking Flathead Lake. She thought about everything the past 2 months had cost her. The ribs still healing, the fever that had nearly taken her in that canyon, the truth that had finally surfaced after 15 years of silence, dragging with it both relief and a fresh, complicated grief that would probably take years more to fully settle. She thought about Dorian Kade, currently sitting in federal custody awaiting hearings that would take months, maybe years, to fully resolve. A man who'd lost everything, trying to force the truth into daylight, then lost himself, trying to build something powerful enough to make that truth matter.
She didn't know yet whether she forgave him. She wasn't sure forgiveness was even the right word for what she felt when she thought of him now. Something more complicated, something that made room for both his guilt and his grief without excusing either. Maybe that was its own kind of truth, the kind her father never quite got to teach her, because some lessons only arrive through living them yourself. She thought about the 14 men who now knew her name, who would carry the story of an unnamed woman who'd saved their lives into whatever came next in their own lives, adding one more thread to a legacy her father had started decades before she was born. She thought about her mother, back in Montana, and the porch where they'd finally sat together and let 15 years of silence break open at once. Ruth had cried, had asked 100 questions Marlowe still didn't have complete answers for. And underneath all of it, underneath the shock and the grief revisited fresh after 15 years, her mother had said one thing that stayed with Marlowe more than any other part of that visit. "He would be so proud of you, baby. He always said you'd be better than him someday." She thought about the raven etched into the stock beneath her fingers, not a symbol of death, she understood now, a symbol of exactly what her father's letter had promised, something carried forward, something that outlasted the person who first gave it meaning. He hadn't carved it for himself. He'd carved it knowing somehow that it would need to mean something to someone else eventually, to her, to whoever needed to recognize it when the truth finally came looking. The wind picked up across the ceremony grounds, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from the reunion still continuing inside. 14 men and their families celebrating a homecoming that had almost never happened at all. Marlowe closed her eyes and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply breathe, not counting, not calculating, not measuring wind speed or range or the careful mathematics of survival that had defined nearly every moment of her adult life. Just breathing. Because the truth had cost her almost everything, exactly as her father always warned it would. And for the first time she finally understood what he'd meant about making sure it was worth the price. It was. It always would be.